Welcome to Fox Creek's Reserve Shiraz Masterclass. I'm Scott Zerner, Chief Winemaker at Fox Creek. I've been here since 2005 and have had the, privilege to be the custodian of Reserve Shiraz for the last 14 years. Thanks for coming along today, and we'll show you a selection of fantastic Reserve Shiraz which really demonstrate the impact of the different vintages on our wines. So what does it mean to be a Reserve Shiraz? Well, that question can be simply defined as it's a Shiraz made up of the best base wine components that we have sitting here in our barrel hall in each particular vintage. But it is actually a little bit more than that. The components that make up our Reserve Shiraz conform to our no compromise policy on quality. Its quality-based practices are implemented all the way from pruning all the way through to the bottle and at every stage in between. The whole process takes about 36 months of hard work and vigilance by everyone at every stage of the process. Another important point is that every single vintage is different. Mother Nature throws us a curveball every single vintage with the weather conditions that we have to contend with. That has a huge impact on the wines that are produced in that vintage and the flavour and tannin profiles that they have. We choose to celebrate these differences rather than smother them into some form of commercial conformity. All of the vineyard selections which we include in our Reserve Shiraz are all a product of us tasting the grapes as we walk up and down the vine rows during the approach to harvest. Over the years, we've worked very hard with our viticulturalists in order to lift the quality of the fruit coming in off the vineyards into the winery. We have done a lot of trials with way the vines are pruned, way they're irrigated. We do some bunch thinning, we select parts of vineyard sections in order to ensure that we get some super premium fruit off the vineyards, which then comes through our state-of-the-art winery that we have here and allows us to produce some fantastic base wines which we can then mature in our barrel hall that you see here behind us. Over the years, we've constructed an oak program which allows us to match the right amount of oak and the right types of oak with the different vineyards in order to support whatever those vineyards need. And so at the moment, that comprises of approximately 35 different oak types that we use, because each different oak has a different job and a different impact on the final wine. The assembly of the final wine is bringing together all these components, from the work done in the vineyards to the work done in the winery, the work done through our oak program, and bringing all those components together to produce some fantastic components from which we can blend our Reserve Shiraz. It's not unusual for us to draw up to 40 or 50 samples out of these barrels in order to do the assembly blending for these particular wines. Often we'll come across barrels which look a little bit better, a little bit more balanced, a little bit more finessed than the other ones in the group, and we then mark that barrel down as being potential for Reserve Shiraz. Once we're ready to blend, we'll pick all those barrels out and take samples back to our lab, and on the bench we'll trial blend all of those components together. Just because they're good enough doesn't mean they're actually included in the blend. Sometimes the blend needs more of some component or less of others, depending on the impact that they have on the construction of the final blend. When we're doing that, we need to make sure that the blend is just right. We have to be fastidious about how we put it together and be absolute with the quality points which we're trying to achieve to make sure that we maintain the status that this wine has. It's been Langton's classified since it was first able to be, so it has a long and successful history on the show circuit as well, as you can see from some of the medals on the bottle. It's fantastic to be able to showcase these wines to you for the Reserve Masterclass. 6 vintages from 2005 through 2010. There's some fantastically contrasting conditions and some fantastic contrasting wines to go with them. Sit back, open a bottle and enjoy. The first wine we have in our tasting is the 2005 Reserve Shiraz. It was actually the first one I was involved with, and I don't know if there's any sentimentality involved, but it is still my favourite of all of this bracket that we're about to look at. The 2005 growing season started early and was quite mild, and there was relatively good amounts of rain through there, so the vines grew a very good canopy, and that allowed the ripening to proceed at a fairly good rate. The warm weather in February accelerated the ripening and brought on the flavour development. Ripening was probably a couple of weeks ahead of what we were anticipating, and the ripening of the components that went into this wine first picked on the 17th of February in 2005. At the end of February we had a very warm weekend, and this sent the remaining fruit that was still on the vine into a tailspin as such, and the ripening accelerated at a huge rate, which meant that there was a very fast influx of harvesting done and the fruit that came into the winery, and that really gave us a lot of dark and quite ripe fruit flavours for the components that were harvested later on in the season. By mid-March, most of our Shiraz was off the vine, and the concentration of flavour was a characteristic of the vintage that really has an impact at the time and is still carried through into the concentration that you see in the bottle today. So it's interesting that this wine still has a huge intensity of colour at, what are we now, 13 years old. The colour has developed into a brick red, but there's still a lot of depth in the glass. Still a lot of savoury notes coming through. There's some examples of bottle development coming on in there, but there's still some remnants of the dark spice and the dark fruit that we saw at the time, all the way back when we were blending this wine in early 2000 or late 2006. On the palate, there's some lovely rich tannin, but still some firmness and still a lot of structure sitting there. So this wine still has some time left in it. Some lovely cherry and plum mulberry characters still sitting there on the mid palate. Its acidity is still sitting in the background behind the tannin, again helping to hold the structure of the wine together. It's a beautifully interesting and complex wine, and the more time that you leave it sit in the glass, the more it opens up and the more it tends to give you. And that's what I love about this wine in general, and that's why it's one of my favourites. It's an interesting, quirky, developing and overall very enjoyable wine. Our next vintage that we're looking at is the 2006 Reserve Shiraz. 2006 was a very straightforward vintage. We had ample spring rains during that growing season, and that led to a huge and very well constructed canopy in protecting the fruit from the warm February temperatures and preserved the very vibrant and pristine red fruit characters that we saw that characterised the 2006 vintage for Shiraz. Further to the textbook vintage, the ripening, harvest and fermentation all proceeded very smoothly, providing us with some pristine, racy, vibrant and overall very high quality batches which we could then put into barrel for maturation. The specific and targeted oak use allowed us to fully express the characteristic and the potentials of each of these batches, and that allowed us to produce a really high quality wine. The resulting wine in 2006 was a rich, full, intense and powerful wine, but had a lot of vibrancy and balance to it. And so that made a very, very complete wine, and we're very proud of our outcome in 2006. Still has a vibrant colour. Its vibrancy hasn't been lost in the ensuing years in the bottle. And on the nose there's some spice, leafiness, herbalness which has been there from its inception. Hints of red fruit still sitting there on the nose, as well as some lovely brown spice characteristics coming in from the oak that we've used. On the palate, its crispness and its vibrancy still holds a lovely focus for the wine. It's a very, very structural and very well balanced wine, and it always has been and will continue to be. Red fruit flavours still fill out the front of the palate. Some lovely cherry and strawberry characters sitting in there, and then some lovely brown spice, cinnamon, nutmeg coming through from the oak, and some dark chocolate. It's a very complete, very balanced wine, which we're very, very proud of. 2007 started off with a huge handicap. During the winter and spring, we only had 25% of our normal rainfall. These dry growing conditions really impacted on the canopy production in the vines and also on the amount of fruit that they produced. The low rainfall also meant a very early start to the irrigation season, so we used a lot more water in that season than we do normally, and the warm conditions that prevailed all the way through the whole growing season led to an early start to the harvest. The warm but not too hot summer was a bit of a godsend in the fact that even though it didn't have a lot of leaf protection, didn't get a lot of sunburn either, so that was quite helpful to the quality of the fruit, and there was no other real impacts on the vines throughout the ripening period, except for one little shower of rain that we got at the end of January, which split even more of the remaining fruit that we had on the vine. So this led to, overall, our intake was down to about 40% of our normal intake off our vineyards, which was quite low indeed, and that gave us a much reduced pool of fruit which we could blend our Shiraz with. The fruit that came in, it showed little ill effect from the tough growing conditions they've been exposed to, and as such we could still produce some fantastically flavoured and some really high quality base wines from that vintage. The wines that produced had some really bright primary fruit, some very crisp and vibrant acidity, and some lovely nice and ripe and rich tannins. We had them in a lot of new oak early on during the maturation period. During the end of its maturation period, we could see that the wines had had enough oak, and so we pulled them out a little earlier than we do in other seasons. That allowed us to get some of the 2008s into some of the oak earlier than we would have otherwise, and that had a good impact for that vintage as well. The resulting wines from 2007 were very elegant, very fruit driven, very crisp and very well structured. They did have a little bit of a lull about 5 or 6 years old, where for some unexplicable and a reason only this wine knows, it looked a little bit clumsy, and the fruit and the tannins had sort of started to come apart from each other. A couple more years of maturation brought them back in together, and the wines are drinking very beautifully right now. Still a very vibrant colour. Just started to get a little bit of brick red through the hue. On the nose, still lots of spice. Some lovely plums and mulberries. Some little toast and a bit of charcuterie as well. The zingy acidity that has always been there is still there. As you can tell by the way my mouth's puckering up at the moment. The tannins are quite firm and very long at this stage. Wine still has very good focus. Red fruit's still sitting at the front. There's some lovely primary cherry and plum fruit sitting right at the front of the palate. So above all, wine that comes from a vintage which was quite difficult during the growing season has come together beautifully well in the end. Good winter rains and a warm spring really helped the start of the growing season for the 2008 vintage. Fantastic vine vigour, built a great canopy which would eventually help the fruit later on in its ripening period. Some extra rains that we had in late December and early January helped top up the soil moisture and keep the production of the vines ticking along nicely, and so we didn't have to irrigate as much as we have in the previous couple of years. The mild temperatures during mid-January and early February brought on some lovely flavour development during the early stages of our ripening period and allowed the vines to tick over quite nicely without being stressed too much. Moving into February, there's some warmer periods but still nothing too hot, and that really brought along some fantastic flavour development and started to ripen the tannins up really nicely. Shiraz harvest started in late February, and some of the early blocks showed some fantastic finesse and some great fruit flavours. Towards the end of the Shiraz ripening, around the middle of March, we had a sustained period of heat where we had 15 days over 35. Luckily for us, most of our premium Shiraz was off the vine and in the winery by that stage, and so we didn't have the Shiraz batches impacted in that particular way. A couple of the other varieties suffered some damage towards the end of that growing season. The reserve Shiraz got through unscathed, which was fantastic news and shows some fantastic intensity and flavour development because of the lovely ripening conditions we had prior to that event occurring. So the 2008 is a big, rich, ripe and bold wine. Fantastic depth of colour and fantastic intensity. On the nose, great big lashings of fruit still there. It's quite a broad spectrum of fruit flavours, from the red through to the black fruit flavours. Fruit aromas you can see on the nose. On the palate, the fruit flavours at the front of the palate are very rich, very voluptuous. They're rich and round and full. The tannins are big and ripe and intense, but very, very soft because the near perfect ripening conditions we had during late February and early March meant that the tannins got to optimal ripeness, and that has allowed them to be very rich, full, but still hang around and persist even to this day, 10 years down the track. Loads of spice, loads of caramel, loads of toast, and still some freshness and intensity that means that this wine will still go probably another 10 years, I'd say. The growing season leading into the 2009 vintage was characterised by yet another dry one. It's following on from those experienced in 2006 and 2007. At the end of January 2009, we managed to trump 2008's 1 in 100 year heat wave with another heat wave. So Mother Nature decided that we needed to have another go at dealing with what was an intense period of heat. This did impact significantly on the white grapes that we produce, and there was a little bit of damage to some of the early blocks of Shiraz. Once the heat wave was over though, we were bathed in probably what was some of the mildest and most perfect ripening weather I've seen here in the Vale. Any of the damaged Shiraz quickly dried up and dropped off, leaving the remaining fruit hanging on the vine to be exposed to some absolutely magnificent weather. This allowed us to pick the fruit when it was of optimal flavour and tannin ripeness, and allowed us to produce some really elegant and beautiful wines, probably some of the most elegant wines that I've seen here at Fox Creek and in the Vale. The fruit developed some beautiful flavours and was really elegant and stylish, and also managed to achieve this at some moderate alcohol levels, so that has led to some beautifully balanced and some exquisite wines. In 2009 won Best Shiraz at the International Wine and Spirit competition in London. Yeah, I don't think we need to say any more about it after that. Still a very deep cherry red, beautifully perfumed on the nose, lovely spice. All these cinnamons and nutmegs and cloves sitting up there. Underlying that, some lovely plum and red cherry characteristics, which come from those lovely mild ripening temperatures. On the palate, the plums and the cherries sit there and still very, very prominent. The tannins are very fine and very elegant and very focused, and that gives a beautifully balanced and structured wine. Its length and finesse and its persistence, I suppose what really defined this wine at the time when we assembled it, and still does to this day. We talk of textbook vintages. Well, 2010 is the ultimate of textbook vintages. Good spring rains, good weather, ripening during set, there was no wind, some very mild conditions coming into the summer periods, which can quite often stress the vines. 2010 we didn't have that. Coming through into the real ripening period in mid-February, and the weather again was still warm enough to allow ripeness to occur, but not too ripe that it stressed the vines out. The impact of that was that it spread the ripening period out in such a way that allowed us to pick each vineyard when it was of optimal ripeness, both for tannin and for flavour. This meant that the winery was never actually full during the whole of the crush period. And so that allowed us the ability to really focus on looking after the wines without any other pressures on us. Being a textbook vintage, everything happened exactly when it should have. The grapes ripened in the right order. They ripened when the particular sub-regions that they belonged to all came in at the right times. Once they came into the winery, they all went through fermentation in the time that they should have. And then they went through malolactic fermentation in the way that they should have. And then we put them to bed and nurtured them all the way through their maturation period. This textbook vintage allowed us to have a fantastic spectrum with all the different vineyards of the fruit flavours that it gave us. And so with all these different fruit flavours and tannin profiles that we had available to us, we were able to create a very elaborate and complex wine, but showed great balance and finesse at the same time. Still very bright cherry red. Pristine fruit on the nose, still sitting there as fresh and vibrant as almost the day it went to bottle. Some lovely spice and perfume coming through as well. The hints of toast and charcuterie come through the front of the palate, in behind all the cherry and plum and strawberry. There's almost a strawberry and cream mid-palate, a little bit of milk chocolate there as well. And some firm toasty tannins giving the wine structure and length, which I suppose give it the length and ability to age, which I think it will do for many, many years to come. Of all the wines, I think this one will probably have a very long life, and a lot of that was probably due to its near perfect vintage conditions.